Start the recording now. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our monthly Therapath virtual lunch and learn. My name's Dr. Arif Noorbash. You can just call me Arif, please. Um, I see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces here today, and we're really glad to have you all here. And like Julia was saying a little bit earlier, for any who couldn't make it today, we will have the recording that will be posted and sent out within a few days afterwards. Today, we have actually a special guest speaker. Dr. Andrew Says is going to be talking to us today a little bit about what makes a drug, how we get a drug from kind of the preclinical scientific work to the clinic, and what that process entails. It's a process that's really complicated. It's a process that most of the rest of the world tries to emulate because we kind of have one of the most rigorous processes for getting drugs to market here. And it's a process that I think a lot of people have a lot of questions about, especially now in the age of all these new interventional treatments like psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, et cetera, ketamine, all these things coming to market for mental health purposes. So we are very happy to have Dr. Sis here with us today. A little bit about Dr. Siz's background. Dr. Sis and I met in residency. We did our training together at UT Southwestern. Excuse me, here in Dallas. He has extensive experience. He participated in this Spravato phase 3 trials while he was on faculty at UT Southwestern. He has experience standing up the UT Southwestern's interventional services program for mental health, where they do ketamine, ECT, Spravato, TMS, et cetera. For the last few years, he's been working in industry. He was on the team that brought Zurzuvae, which is the first postpartum depression oral medication to market. And he currently does research on novel medications for schizophrenia. So with that, I will turn over the floor to Dr. Sis.
Cool. Thanks so much for introducing me, Dr. Noorbash, and great to be here. And thanks for joining. The joke when and people who work in drug development is that your disclosure page is your CV or it's your resume. And I'm very passionate about disclosures. I think it's always really important to understand where people are coming from when they tell you information, particularly in drug development, where there is such a storied history of bad behavior when it comes to presenting data and talking about drugs. So just to start there, as Dr. Noorbash already mentioned, I currently work for a small biotech called Map Therapeutics. We're private, and almost no one's ever heard of us. That's actually where a lot of drug development really initiates nowadays, particularly in the mental health field. A lot of these like small companies start developing something, and then eventually it gets bought out by Bristol Myers Squibb or AbbVie or some of these big kind of traditional big pharma. I've actually never worked for big pharma. I've only worked for these small companies, and so my opinions might be biased towards that. Um, but it is a disclosure. I'm currently employed by a company developing drugs, and so I may have some bias related to that, specifically any bias around the development of drugs for psychosis or autism, since that's what we currently do. And I do currently own equity as part of my employment there. Um, and then, as Dr. Noorbash mentioned, I also worked for a company called Sage Therapeutics, which developed Zurzuvae, which is now approved for postpartum depression. I don't own any equity in them anymore, but I may have bias from my good experience working there. And then lastly, I did receive what's called contracted research support from Janssen when they were developing Spravato for treatment-resistant depression. And basically, what that means is I wasn't an employee of them, but I was running an independent research clinic as part of UT Southwestern, and Janssen would pay us to see patients as part of that clinical trial, which is basically how all clinical trials operate these days. The drug companies don't actually see patients or hire doctors to see patients in their studies. They find these clinics all across the United States and globally to see patients for them, and they kind of pay them, you do this visit, we'll pay you X dollars, et cetera. And I think part of the idea is it creates some independence from the drug developer and the actual doctors seeing those patients. At least that's the idea. Um, so these are my disclosures. I'm really probably not going to talk too much about my current role at MapLight or at Sage. I'll talk a little bit about the development of Spravato as a case example towards the end. Really, what I'd love to talk about is how do we go from a patient who might be experiencing symptoms, talking to their doctor, the doctor makes a diagnosis and says, "Hey, I think this medication might be helpful for you." They prescribe it, and then the patient comes back, 4 to 8 weeks later and says, "Hey, I'm doing great." How does all of this happen, right? Um, and so to start, I just want to talk about what prescription medications are. These are highly regulated products. And what that means is that there is some regulatory body. In the US, it's the FDA. Every country has their own. They all kind of operate a little bit differently, like they have different rules, right? Which is why you can go down to Mexico and buy a lot of medications without a prescription because their regulatory body says, hey, you don't need a prescription for, testosterone. You can just buy it over the counter at a pharmacy. But every country has those regulatory bodies. Ours is the FDA. They do a lot of things, but a big one is regulating certain chemicals that we call medications. Um, and what I mean by regulate is actually a couple different things. First of all, they say whether or not something can be sold at all. Like, is this something that your people are allowed to buy? But then they also do a lot of other stuff, like regulate how it's manufactured. Are there impurities being introduced in the manufacturing process that could be dangerous? When you buy a 10 milligram tablet of Adderall, does it have 10 milligrams? Does it have 10.5 milligrams? Does it have 20 milligrams? So really strict control over that. And then they also have a lot to say about how the drug is marketed, right? So they don't just allow people to go out there and say, hey, this we're going to call this miracle because it's a miracle for everything. They actually control when a new drug comes on the market, what its name is, which is why you get some of those really weird names for drugs. They have very strict rules on what they're allowed to say. And the FDA does actually a lot more than just regulating drugs. They regulate things like our food, hence Food and Drug Administration. They regulate other things we might put on our body, like cosmetics. They do regulate dietary supplements, which are kind of in between medications and food in terms of what they are, right? And they also regulate medical devices in a way that's somewhat analogous to how medications are regulated because they are a thing that are being used specifically to treat a disease, as opposed to food additives, cosmetics, and even dietary supplements are not. The distinction is these are not necessarily being used explicitly to treat a disease, although often we might, use a dietary supplement, herbal supplement to treat a condition. Um, and so all these things are regulated very differently. And just to kind of help illustrate that difference, medications to get approved, you have to have extensive data supporting their efficacy. Whereas for a dietary supplement, there's really no requirement that it's going to help or prevent any kind of medical condition. Medication, there is this very rigorous safety review process that has to go on, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Whereas again, a dietary supplement, it's really basically saying that there's no real known risks, and the FDA doesn't oversee the manufacturing very closely. There's some minimum stuff, but it's very different than how a medication is reviewed. And then finally, and I think this is the most apparent day to day to us when you look at advertisements for a supplement versus a prescription medication, is how the marketing is regulated. Sometimes you'll see just really outlandish claims about what a supplement might do, and then you look at a prescription medication. And anytime you hear someone talking about it, you might kind of say this might be useful for a specific condition. Talk to your doctor about this medication for your bipolar disorder. And then you also hear a laundry list of it may cause, weight gain and sedation and blah, blah, blah. Whereas you don't have that kind of thing with dietary supplements. Um, so we're going to be focusing just on prescription medications. And so these start in the lab, but then eventually they end up in the clinic. So, the question is, how do we do this? What are all those steps along the way? Um, I'll say those steps usually take somewhere between 10 and 15 years from when it starts in the lab and goes to the clinic. And I'll walk you through an example of what that looks like in a minute. And the cost is usually something around $500 million to $2 billion to make this step. So it is a huge investment. And it's something like 10% of drugs that start in the lab ever make it to the clinic. Maybe even a little bit less, depending on how you define the starting place. And so, obviously, the further along you get, the more time and money you've spent. And so, your loss is greater depending on how far you are. But the point is, it's a big gamble that it's a really long-term payoff, which, makes it a very kind of interesting business and how you progress. So the first step is the lab, and this is where chemists look for what we call new chemical entities, so chemical structures that we've never used as a drug before. Or sometimes they will repurpose known chemicals. That gets really tricky when it comes to patents, which I'll talk about in a second, though. And they're looking for in a drug candidate many different properties. Some of these are very practical, like is it easy to manufacture, or is it something that can be patented? To things that actually really matter for its promise or how good it could be as a drug, like does it seem to cause significant toxicity based off of how it works? Is it something that we can take by mouth and it easily absorbs in our gut into our blood? And if it's a mental health drug, then we also have to make sure it can get from the blood into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. And so we have all these really sophisticated models based off of the chemical structure to kind of predict some of these things. And there are some assays you can run in a lab to kind of start to get at these questions. But ultimately, you may not fully know the answers to toxicity or how well it's absorbed until you start testing it in animals and humans. And then once you've checked all these boxes, you need to also have some idea of is this something that can actually treat a medical condition, right? Could this be therapeutic? And is it unique enough compared to what we already have for that condition? So we could easily make another SSRI, but do we really need another SSRI? Right? We've got like six or seven, and they've all got slight differences. Would an eighth really be that impactful to spend 10, 15 years working on and potentially risk billions of dollars? Maybe, maybe not. Um, the patent piece, I want to talk about very briefly because it is really important and very relevant day to day, right? Because we hear a lot about, oh, there's a brand name drug or a generic drug, and that's all driven based off of whether the drug is patented still. And we have these patents, to incentivize people to make those billion-dollar gambles on whether a drug should be developed or not, so that hopefully the manufacturers will have some return on their investment. Because if they just spent all this money and the drug got approved and anyone could make it, how would they make money back? There are a lot of potential different models than what this is, but this is currently how it is set up right now, and is really the driving force for why someone would want to develop a new medication outside of the goodness of their own heart and trying to solve all the ailments that humans experience. A typical drug patent lasts 20 years. And so if development takes 10 years, that means you have another 10 years where it's branded. If it takes 15 years, you only have 5 years where it's branded. And given that drugs can make anywhere from 100 million to $10 billion per year, every extra year of patent means a lot of money for the drug company. And so obviously they want to kind of develop things fast, but they want to also do it very methodical so they don't waste money if it fails. So it's a really complicated ballet that they do. Um, so once you have a good candidate, maybe it's patentable, you think it could go somewhere, has some legs, then typically before you go to humans, you want to do some level of animal testing. And frankly, I think it is quite extensive. Usually drugs are investigated in multiple species, and they go through all sorts of different things from just observing the animals to looking at changes in chemistry in their blood to actually pathology. It's a really important step, but also one that really pulled at my heartstrings a little bit just thinking about these animals. But it is a standard step of development. And really the goal is to understand whether or not there are any major safety concerns before we bring these to humans. Sometimes they'll also try to get at efficacy or whether the drug works or not. And this is actually somewhat easy to do in things like cancer, where you have really good animal models of cancer. They're not perfect; they still have their problems, but they're much closer to the human disease than our animal models of things like depression or schizophrenia, which are really far away from what the humans experience. But once you've completed this full, kind of a standard animal safety package, then you're ready to initiate studies in humans. And this is what some people may have heard of before as the beginning of the phase studies, phase one, phase two, and phase three. Um, and so when you begin phase one, you basically ask the FDA's permission. You put together everything we know about the drug, all those animal testings, and say, hey, this is what we've seen. We think this is safe to initiate in humans. And this is how we plan to start initiating them in humans. What do you think, FDA? And you package that into what's called an investigational new drug application. The FDA, will look at that, and if they have concerns, they may not allow you to do it, or they may ask you, "Hey, we have concerns, but can you do these things differently to make it more safe?" Or they say, "Great, this looks very reasonable. Please go ahead." And so once you begin, you have what's called the first in human studies. And these are very kind of slow and methodical, where you give, a very low dose of the drug to a very small number of people. Often you'll literally give it to two people one day, see if they're okay, give it to two more people the next day, etc. And kind of when you get comfortable with one dose, then you might do the same thing at a higher dose. So 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, do that in a small cohort, go up to 5, go up to 10, however high you think you might need to go, or until you hit what's called a maximally tolerated dose, where the participants have some kind of adverse event that's unacceptable to proceed with. And this can obviously be very serious things like a seizure. Um, Typically, though, it's more about like a discomfort thing, like, oh, I got really nauseous, or the blood pressure started to drop really low. And that kind of gives you a sense of, okay, this is the highest we should ever go with this drug. A lot of times, though, you don't find a maximally tolerated dose because your drug seems to be tolerated at a dose that you believe, based off of your, preclinical work, is going to be therapeutic. And so this kind of establishes some of the basics of the tolerability of the drug, and kind of says, okay, this is not like super dangerous to give to humans at these doses. And so now let's start thinking about testing this in people who actually have the disease. And that's typically, you might call it a first in disease study. Usually this occurs in what we call phase two, where you begin testing it in that patient population. Oftentimes you'll still be playing with dose or doing dose finding. In phase one, the dose finding was more about finding the doses that are safe. Here, you're trying to find the doses that might be effective. Because of course, certain drugs might only work at a certain dose. And sometimes you can have the dose be too low, of course, but there are some cases where the dose is too high and it actually can start impacting how well the drug works. Um, these studies, are kind of preliminary evidence of efficacy or how well it works, and usually are a small number of patients, something in the magnitude of 50 to 200. So you might run a study where you have 4 different treatment groups, all testing a different dose. And each one is 50 participants. That gets you up to 200 people. Um, Once you have completed these studies, and you have promised that the drug works in the disease, now you're ready to invest in a much bigger study, which is what phase three is. And so these are considered large efficacy, and really we're also now starting to care about establishing exactly how safe it is as well. And you need large numbers of people to establish safety, because there might be things that only occur in 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 500 people. And so you really start to need to get into thousands of people to have some comfort that those things aren't existing. And so phase three will usually involve between 1,000 and 2,000 participants with the disease. And these generate what the FDA and others consider substantial evidence of efficacy. Um, Typically, the minimum you would do to establish this is 2 short-term studies, especially in psychiatry. So, a 6 to 12 week study of a new antidepressant or a new antipsychotic, um, where uh, approximately half or a third of the patients will receive placebo, and then the rest will receive active drug. It'll be randomized, it'll be blinded. No one will know what the participant received. Um, And that gets you at that real efficacy data as well as some kind of short-term safety data. And then typically you'll also do some kind of long-term safety study where everyone receives the study drug. They know they received the study drug, and you're really kind of looking for those rare events, things again like a seizure. You wouldn't expect, out of 1,000 people for anyone to have a seizure for the first time in their life. And so if you give this drug to 1,000 people, and like 10 people have seizures, that's much higher than what you would expect and kind of allows you to say, okay, there might be a risk there. And so you run these phase 3 studies. A typical short-term study might look like this, where you would screen the patient for, a couple of weeks to make sure it's appropriate to put them in the study. They actually have the disease. They don't have any significant medical conditions that would be problematic to test this new drug in. Um, Once they look like a good candidate, you would randomize them. And, in this case, we've got a placebo arm and then two different doses that are being tested. And then they would receive blinded treatment. So they don't know which one they've got, in this case for 8 weeks. And then you would evaluate whether the drug was effective at that 8 week time point. And then usually you'll have some kind of safety follow up a week or two, maybe a month afterwards, to just make sure that there was nothing kind of lingering that happened that it took a little bit longer to see. And that when they stopped the drug, nothing crazy happened there either. Uh, Now, one of the tricky things about psychiatry and mental health is what are you measuring here? How do you show a drug works, right? In cancers, might see the tumor shrinks or goes away, right? In a blood pressure study, you would see does the blood pressure go down? Um, so, we really have to operationalize this in an objective, standardized way when we're talking about treating mental health disorders. And so we use what are called psychiatric rating scales, some of which y'all may be familiar with, because sometimes we do use these in clinical practice. Um, but these are basically structured interviews where an assessor will ask the participants, questions about their symptoms in a very standardized way, and then based off of their responses, score them. In each scale, the point system's a little bit different. And so here's an example from the MADRS, which is a scale of depression. It's 10 items. One of the items focuses just on how sad the patient reports they are. And there's another question that reports on how sad the patient looks. And so in this one, it's rated 0 through 6. Someone who scores the highest, they're just kind of reporting they're miserable 24/7, every single day, every moment of the day. If something good happens, they can't even respond to it. That's how bad they feel. And then like a 4 is it's pretty much all the time. But like if they got some good news, they could kind of cheer up. And then a 5 would be something kind of in between that if you're not really sure which ones they are. And so basically, whatever symptom we're trying to treat, we'll come up with an objective score of how severe they are. They're not perfect scores, and there's actually a lot of problems with them, but they're the best we have, and they're not bad by any means. Um, Once you have your data and it's effective and all that jazz, you basically submit the data package to the FDA in a new drug application. This will include everything that's been done from the lab to phase 3, including some other things that I haven't talked about, like exactly how the drug is going to be manufactured and a bunch of smaller studies, such as drug-drug interaction studies. A lot of data. So the FDA typically takes about a year to review this. And sometimes the decision is not black and white at all, especially if it's a new therapeutic area and there's never been a drug like it before. Um, Once it's approved, though, that it doesn't really stop the data collection. The FDA almost always will ask for what are called post-marketing studies, because there are often important lingering questions about the drug that were not yet addressed. They're not so big that they should prevent the drug from hitting the market and helping people as soon as possible, but they are things that long term we should get some answers to. And so this is like a negotiation between the drug company and the FDA, exactly what kinds of studies any given drug might need to do. Um, and then once it's available to prescribe, it's approved. The drug development often continues. Often, a drug will be investigated for other conditions. So, like schizophrenia drugs are often then studied in bipolar disorder or even in major depressive disorder. And ultimately that kind of boils down to, is the science supportive of it, but then also is the business supportive? Do you have a long enough patent life where you're going to get a return on investment of this? Which is really unfortunate that that plays out, because sometimes drugs really could be useful for other indications, but there's no incentive to run those large studies. Um, and so this is just a kind of a case example of an antipsychotic that was approved a few years ago, Caplyta. It began in the clinic in the early 2000s and actually stayed there in animal testing for about 8 years. Their phase one program was actually a little bit longer than usual. It lasted about 5 years. They ran a phase two program in 2013, took about a year. And then they ran a phase three program over about 3 years. And then wrapping that up and getting it FDA approved took another year and a half. And so it hit the market almost 19 years after it was first kind of started. And then after that, they said, hey, this might be useful in bipolar depression, and began a phase three program for that. And it got approved for bipolar depression 2 years later. And I think they're just about to get approval for major depression as well. Um, that's kind of a very typical situation. Some of them are much more complicated, though, and Spravato or esketamine and the psychedelics in general are good examples of that. And so in the early 2000s, they noticed that ketamine might be useful for developing depression. Academic studies were conducted, and there was all this evidence it might be a useful treatment. Um, and so while there was this data, though, it wasn't what the FDA needs to get a drug approved. And very specifically, there were no long-term animal studies or no long-term human studies, and that's really critical for the FDA to approve a drug. And these were just a bunch of academics doing things. No drug companies were all that interested in developing ketamine, mostly for business reasons. It wasn't patentable. And so they would have to invest billions of dollars, but then anyone could just sell it. There wasn't a business incentive. Um, However, they kind of came up with this clever is maybe too generous of a word, but their solution was, since ketamine is a mixture of two chemicals, let's take just one of those two chemicals, which is patentable, and we will develop that. And that's basically what Spravato became. They were able to patent esketamine. They also got some patents for the delivery mechanism. And so now this is an approved drug that only Janssen can sell, and other people can't. However, people can continue to use just regular ketamine. Um, but because it is an FDA approved drug, this really obligates insurance providers to offer it as a drug. It becomes really hard to not cover a drug once it has that FDA seal of approval, unlike ketamine, which doesn't. And it's one of the consequences of how drugs are regulated in the US and insurance companies work. I'm going to stop there and happy to answer questions. Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. If you have any questions, you can either just raise your hand using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the toolbar in Zoom, or throw it in the chat, and I'll make sure to introduce that to Dr. Says. I can kind of lead us off a little bit. Uh, this has been very helpful. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us kind of the overview. Um, I know that the FDA, so I think a lot of people would be kind of maybe a little shocked to discover that it costs a minimum of $500 million or $500 million to get a drug to market. Aside from just like the primary safety and efficacy studies that you talked about, my understanding is that oftentimes the FDA requires a lot more like extra studies of various things. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah. So, this is very dependent on the exact drug and kind of what we expect it to do. But for example, if a drug is thought, if we see when we test it in humans that some patients get drowsy on the drug, they feel tired, sedated, um, then it might be like, oh, well, this could be concerning. We need to better understand that before we approve it for a drug. And so we need to kind of study the sedation or the drowsiness in an objective way. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll have them complete like computerized batteries, almost like video games, and see how well they perform on these cognitive tests. But almost every drug that has some degree of sedation, they actually go through this very formalized driving simulator work where you put someone in a very kind of sophisticated, almost like virtual reality driving game, and you have them drive after taking the drug, 4 hours ago, 8 hours ago. And because it's all digital, it kind of records every movement that you make in the car, and you get quantified things like how much they deviated from the lane, and stuff like that. Other examples would be, there are any drug that gets developed, you have to like do EKGs on patients, and you measure some of those cardiac parameters. And so if there is any kind of concern about how the drug might affect your heart function, then you will do a dedicated heart physiology study where you actually give the patients a drug that is known to transiently and mildly affect heart conduction. And then you actually, as a positive control, and then you give them your drug and you kind of compare how the heart physiology changes with your drug. So a lot of it's like very driven by the kind of side effects that are observed with the given drug. But there's a lot. There's usually probably like somewhere between 5 and 10 of these kind of miscellaneous smaller studies that required for development of any drug. And, most of them are highly specialized things, things like you have to find a facility that has one of uh, these driving simulators.
Thank you. I think we have a question in the chat from Dr. Toll. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Toll. And so he's interested in some of your thoughts on kind of new drug development, kind of adjunctive to other treatments like TMS, to increase durability, and kind of the FDA using EEG data as proof of efficacy for things like TMS or adjunctive treatments.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I'll take the biomarker piece first, EEG, right? So the FDA is very excited about being able to use biomarkers to identify patients that might preferentially respond to a treatment or not. We don't have any in psychiatry right now. And so, there's kind of this excitement that this could be the future and so forth. It's really tricky, and there's a few companies that are trying to use biomarkers as part of their development. So instead of developing the drug for just anyone who has depression, developing it for people who have depression plus a biomarker, like an EEG signal. Um, it hasn't been successful yet, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. I think that one of the challenges is the business case of it, which is that you want to develop a drug that anyone can take who has the disease. And if you narrow that population, then you just have less market share. And so there's been almost a disincentive for this kind of biomarker development. You know, uh, I think there may be a path forward, but no one's shown it yet. And I think what that path would look like is if you could say, boy, this drug works better than anything else with this biomarker, then you may be able to convince most insurance providers to cover it in that population. Um, your second question, the second piece of your question, though, is really interesting, which is like the interaction of a treatment of different treatment modalities. And so, like, getting a drug approved in conjunction with therapy, or getting a drug approved in conjunction with something like TMS. Um, and again, there's not a lot of examples of that in psychiatry. The psychedelics are kind of skirting this issue a little bit, because part of, a lot of some of the psychedelic research is not just giving psilocybin, but giving psilocybin with therapy. And this is a really tricky issue that the FDA is actually actively navigating, is like, what is our role in regulating therapy in the context of a drug that's being given? Because the FDA has never regulated therapy, right? No one's ever had to talk to the FDA about, well, I'm going to do this kind of therapy with my patient. Is not approved, right? And they really don't want to get into that game. But it may be such an important piece of how the drug works that they kind of do have to weigh in or not. But I think they're still kind of figuring that out. And then I think that the same thing with TMS would hold true. Is like the FDA, they do regulate TMS. It's through that whole separate medical device pathway. And so the way that TMS and things like ECT are regulated is very different than how the drugs are. And those paths have never crossed before. And I don't think there's a lot of incentive for drug developers to cross those paths because, again, you're kind of making your drug already more niche. TMS isn't like wildly popular. It's great and it's a wonderful treatment, but it's just not a lot of people get it done compared to how many people take a pill at home. And so to develop a drug that like would only be useful when it's prescribed with TMS would be really tricky.
Thank you. We have, and I think we'll make this kind of one of our last questions. Ken has a question about kind of the current climate and all the changes at FDA and other regulatory agencies, how that might affect, or what your thoughts on how that might affect like QC or quality control standards, development of new medications, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I know you're in active, a collaboration and communication with the FDA on current drug development. So I know how much you may be able to answer to that or speak to that might
Yeah.
be limited.
Yeah, I mean, I probably don't have that much more insight than anyone else does. A lot of the changes have not been particularly public. All what I've heard is that there's has been a lot of changes, either people leaving or, these broader changes in the federal government, which I suspect has also affected the FDA. And I think what I can say as somewhat of an expert in this area is that in general, drug development thrives in stability because as you saw, it's like a 10 to 15 year horizon for drug development. So you plan out how the next 10, 15 years are going to go. And so whenever there's a kind of a change in any piece of that, including the regulatory authorities, it creates a lot of uncertainty and can impact how people plan out this long development process.
Thank you. And to close this out, I might ask a kind of a final question. I know there's a lot of kind of um, at times like this idea that like industry is like collaborating with the FDA in some way that's not above board or something else.
Mm.
Would you mind speaking just a little bit to the kind of, I know the communication between, pharmaceutical companies and the FDA and regulators is very regulated in and of itself.
Yeah.
And I think hearing about that a little bit might be helpful for some.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, especially nowadays. I think again, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I hear stories about backroom dealings and people being buddy buddy. I don't know how much that's true, but from my experience, it's an incredibly formalized process. Everything's in writing. To even have communications, you almost have to kind of request a meeting or a written response or something like that. Um, and I think it's very reassuring. If anything, I think one of the ways that drug development can go faster is if there was more fluid or more frequent communication with the FDA, because again, companies want to plan out 10, 15 years of stuff. And so getting their input as frequent as regular as possible is incredibly valuable, so that drug developers kind of know what to predict and what to do. Otherwise, you're just like making a lot of guesses that you hope are right. Um, so yeah.
Excellent. All right. Any other last questions or concerns from the group? Okay, well, we really appreciate Dr. Sis joining us today, and I appreciate everybody who's come to join our latest virtual Lunch and Learn. As we said before, the recording will be sent out in a few days. If you have any follow-up questions or concerns, you're more than welcome to email us. And we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, y'all. Have a good one.
Thank